to 24 Plight. Let's go, let's go. I will use up all of my phone space if I have to. I will see this duel to the end, and you guys will see it with me too, okay? Let's go! Go, go, go! The impact on the water was as if falling on solid ground. Plucky partially blacked out as he plunged into the white water before being helplessly thrown around like a rag doll by the current of the river rapids. Left in a weak daze, he thrashed around, trying to raise his head above the water. For a moment he did, and gasped for air, before the current dragged him back underneath the surface. Desperately he tried to paddle around with his paws, too, and balance himself. But to no avail. The water was relentless. Relentless as his grey fox foe, who was nowhere to be seen. He was carried far down the river. At least it felt like far. Plucky endured this submerged watery torture for what felt like hours, but it couldn't have been more than a few minutes. He tried and tried again to reach the surface for another breath inhale, each time being dragged back underneath. Eventually, as he was pulled further downstream, he got caught on a fallen log, protruding into the water. Plucky went into it with some force, momentarily winding him, but he clasped onto it tightly with his claws. He lifted himself further out of the water while it continued to crash into him hard. He didn't have the strength to lift himself out, so slowly and carefully he edged along the log to the riverbank. As Plucky edged along, he slowly emerged from the water and reached the bank. He stood shakily on his legs and, dripping wet, wandered further onto the solid ground, before collapsing with exhaustion and panting heavily. Oh my god. Thank God, Plucky survived that. That's cool. Some minutes passed, allowing Plucky to regain some strength. The rain from the storm was still coming down, thick and persistent, though the thunder was not as vigorous. Plucky couldn't care less. He was already completely drenched to his core, the cold enveloping him. He was ultimately shocked he'd actually survived the fall and the peril of the river rapids, let alone to have escaped his assailant. He crawled across the ground to the shelter of a small coppice tree. Plucky looked around. He couldn't see the cliff from where he and Caesar fell from. He thought for a moment what his mate and family must be thinking. They must presume he was dead. But of course, Plucky was far from dead. Though unfortunately, so was his adversary. Fuck you, Caesar! Sorry, I had to say it. From behind him, Plucky heard footsteps and panting. He got up and turned, standing defensively. Caesar was there, stood atop the fallen log, a look of hatred on his face. He too had survived, and too was completely drenched. That was a bold move. Caesar spoke callously, breathing heavily. But I'm still standing. You gotta be kidding me, Plucky muttered under his breath. Plucky was in no condition to continue the fight, but he could still run despite his legs still hurting and bleeding. Caesar leapt at him violently. Plucky reared up and purposely fell backwards. With all his strength, he pushed Caesar over him with all four paws as the grey fox was midair. Oh, Simba from the Lion King maneuver! Caesar fell hard on the ground, perplexed from Plucky's countermove, but quickly got up. The red fox wasted no time. He rolled to his front and launched himself the other way, attempting to run. It looks like the fight's still going, Dale, but it looks like it's transformed into a chase. That's right, Tucker. Looks like we're going to be watching this race from now on, although our other supporters won't be there since we're far away from them. Upon seeing him disappear through the adjacent wood, Caesar called out menacingly. You can run, but you can't hide! He then ran in pursuit of his fleeing rival. You're talking to the fastest fox in White Deer Park, bitch! Plucky ran on through the wood, zigzagging between the trees. His pace was not as quick as it could have been. He was exhausted and his weak legs still ached and bled. The bite mark Caesar had put in his neck too bled vigorously. It had reduced his strength considerably. Luckily, though Caesar too had suffered his own injuries and was not at his best, yet his pursuit of the red fox was still unyielding. Suddenly, Plucky came to a halt. He had reached a small ledge at the end of the woodland, but now looked out upon a section of it that had been felled. The massive clearing was littered with tree stumps and stripped bare fallen logs. The ground around had become a muddy, waterlogged wasteland, with no live trees to absorb the persistent rainfall. Plucky noticed a large wooden building the far side of the boggy, deforested area. Not that he knew, the structure was a sawmill, long since abandoned by the humans, and the area left for Mother Nature to slowly reclaim. With the gray fox hot on his tail, Plucky decided to head for the structure, though he wasn't sure what for. A human structure wouldn't deter his foe any less than himself. Nevertheless, Plucky went on. He leaped from the ledge as Caesar came into view behind him. Though instead of landing on solid ground, he fell right into the bog, getting covered in mud as he did. He sank deep into it, but managed to lift himself out, the sludge matting his fur. Just opening a gate. He went to wander on, but was then knocked sideways by Caesar leaping at him. Plucky fell back into the bog from his attack, but quickly swiped his paw through the mud, cupping a small lump of it before throwing it into Caesar's face. With the grey fox distracted, Plucky continued on towards the sawmill, staggering through the bog between the felled tree stumps. Caesar quickly composed himself and followed. Enduring the muck of the bog and soaking rain, Plucky reached the building, and as soon as he was on firmer ground, he got up to a run and climbed inside through a hole from some broken wood wall panels. The sawmill was an old wooden structure. Its long period of abandonment had left it in a state of disrepair, most of the wood rotten and metal rusted. The structure was unstable, yet all the wood-cutting machinery was still inside, and it was surprisingly dry, despite the storm raging outside. Wood chips and sawdust littered the floor. Large logs were stacked in the far corner of the structure, and finely cut pieces in the other. The conveyor still had a large half-cut piece of wood on it, plus a couple of discarded metal chains. Some other chains dangled from the ceiling on pulleys and swung slightly as the building creaked. The large, intimidating circular saw at the end of the conveyor was old, rusty, and blunt, but was still connected to the petrol engine that powered it. A petrol engine which still had fuel in it. As the structure was designed for human use, Plucky couldn't get a good viewpoint from where he stood on the ground. No doubt Caesar would follow him inside. Plucky could try to ambush him. He looked around and saw an elevated part of the floor accessible by some metal steps, a small room separated by a thin pane of glass. Not that the fox knew it, it led up to the controls for the buzzsaw. Plucky's chance to ambush his foe soon faded as Caesar came running through the same hole in the wall Plucky had entered. He charged straight at the red fox, but Plucky dodged out the way and swiftly climbed the metal steps into the control room, Caesar quickly following.
It looks like the chase has gone into the sawmill, Dale. That's right, Tucker. This is getting even more heated up than before.
As Plucky tried to jump up onto the control panel to get a good vantage point, Caesar caught up to him and bit Plucky's tail as he jumped, dragging him to the floor. Caesar once again went for the kill, but Plucky turned and bit into Caesar's already injured shoulder, making him gasp.
Yeah! Take that!
It deterred the grey fox long enough for Plucky to leap atop the controls. His intention was to leap at Caesar with enough force he could leave him in a daze long enough he could go for the kill, or at least force the old grey fox to surrender. As Plucky climbed up, however, he leant on a small lever, and the lever fell. Suddenly, a loud groaning noise was emitted from the machinery. The conveyor sprung to life, and gradually started dragging the large wood pieces towards the large circular saw, which had begun to spin and slice through the wood. Although startled, the two foxes continued to fight. Plucky initiated his plan. He leapt down from the controls towards Caesar. But the grey fox dodged, and without a chance for the red fox to react, rapidly ran into Plucky's side, pushing him hard against the glass, which cracked. It was Plucky who was left winded and dazed now, and suddenly Caesar backed up and rammed into him again, this time smashing through the glass. As the glass smashed, both foxes fell through, right onto the conveyor leading to the spinning buzzsaw. A shard of the glass had found its way into Plucky's right thigh, and a couple more on his back. Caesar too had some glass lodged in him, none of them fatal. The conveyor continued to move, dragging the large pieces of wood to be segregated by the circular saw. Atop of them, the two foxes continued to scuffle violently, unaware of the predicament they were in.
Oh my, this is going to be a cut above the rest if they're not careful. You said it, Tucker.
Weakened even more so from the fall, Plucky barely had a chance to move before Caesar was on him again. He leaned hard onto Plucky's neck with his front claws, cutting off his airway. Plucky gasped and struggled again under Caesar's overpowering strength. Plucky noticed behind the grey fox that was strangling him. There was a chain dangling from the ceiling from a pulley fixed to a joist. It looked loose. And he had an idea. In desperation, Plucky used his free left rear leg to wind it around the dangling iron chain. He focused all his remaining and quickly dissipating strength into it as Caesar leaned harder on his neck. Plucky felt faint. He was going lightheaded as he gasped for air, so the task became more and more difficult as the seconds passed. Once it was wound tight enough, with all his remaining force, he tried to yank it down where it was locked into the pulley on the ceiling. He pulled on it several times in a matter of seconds as the air was being squeezed from his lungs. The fixing for the hoist shifted slightly, being stuck in rotting wood, but it still clung on. Just one more yank would do it. Come on, Plucky! Come on, Plucky! Suddenly, Caesar leant off Plucky's neck, and Plucky gasped loudly, continuing to pant to catch his breath. But Caesar wasn't finished with him. He intended to finish him off there and then. With the realization his next breath could be his last, Plucky summoned up an enormous super strength and yanked the chain one last time with his leg. The pulley broke free from its fixing in the joist, snapping the rod and beam where it was weakened. The chain and the pulley fell from the rafters, falling on top of both foxes, and the heavy metal pulley fell straight onto Caesar's head, knocking him out instantly.
Whew! Oh, that's a knockout right there, Dale. That's right, Tucker. Get in!
Both foxes lay still on the conveyor. Plucky still panted, now with utmost relief, while Caesar was out cold. After retuning his senses after his choking, his attention was brought to the malevolent spinning buzzsaw at the end of the conveyor, which was barely 1.5 meters away. Plucky rummaged free from under the heavy metal chains and was about to jump off the conveyor to safety, but he suddenly looked back to his unconscious foe. Caesar was still alive and breathing, but the cast iron pulley had made a large gash in his head, and he barely stirred. If Plucky did nothing, the grey fox would be severed in half by the spinning saw. He thought about killing him, but something was stopping him. Plucky was no killer, and no one deserved a gruesome death like that. They continued to be dragged closer to the saw, now barely 1 meter away. Plucky had no idea why, as this fox he had decided to save was previously trying to kill him. But he wasn't going to leave him to die. There was no honor or respect in that. Plucky dragged the iron chains from atop Caesar and pushed him off the conveyor before jumping off himself. Caesar fell to the floor with a thud. The small fall had stirred the old grey fox from his unconsciousness. He was in a daze, bewildered by what had just happened, and he gave Plucky a look of confusion. They were safe from the spinning circular saw, but they were soon to realize they were far from safe. Before anything could be said between them, a terrible, metallic screeching noise caused both foxes to flatten their ears against their heads. The iron chain that was left on the conveyor had been cut by the buzzsaw, and as it was blunt, could not cut through it. Instead, the chain had lashed around the mechanism, stopping the saw from spinning, but the engine was still in motion. Eventually, it began to overheat, and it glowed loudly. A loud pop occurred. Smoke started pouring from around it, and eventually sparked and burst into flames with a bright flash. Oh god, I'm getting empathy, Chapter 13, flashbacks! The sparks and flames immediately ignited the surrounding wood and sawdust, which caught the flames instantly. Oh, not again, Plucky exasperated, once again having to escape a fire. Again? Caesar asked bewilderedly. Plucky ignored and instead commanded him. Come on! We gotta get out of here! Caesar wasn't going to argue with that. They put aside their rivalry to escape the flames. Caesar rose to his legs and followed Plucky to the place they entered the building. The flames had quickly engulfed much of the wood structure. In a matter of a few seconds, it had become an uncontrollable inferno due to all the dry wood products. The heat was immense. It lightly singed the fur of the foxes' backs. The structure began to collapse as it burned. Beams and joists from the ceiling began to fall and crash to the ground. Cracking wood and shearing metal coupled with the crackling of the fire was all that could be heard, and embers of burning lumber felt like rain.
Everything is on fire now, Dale. That's right, Tucker. This is burning hot.
Suddenly, a burning joist fell in front of Caesar, but he decided to crawl underneath it. But as he did, it collapsed, trapping one of his back legs in his tail, causing him to gasp in anguish as it scorched his fur. Plucky turned around to see the grey fox struggle underneath the wood beam. He could very easily leave him there to die, But even though he was his enemy, it went against everything Plucky believed in. Caesar needed help, yet didn't call out for it. But Plucky went to his aid regardless. "Take my paw!" Plucky shouted through the noise of the crackling flames, creaking wood, and shearing metal. "Come on, Plucky, save him! Caesar, just take his paw, please!" Caesar was reluctant to do so, but he would have burned to death if he didn't. He reached his paw out, hooking it around Plucky's, and they pulled to release his leg and tail. Carrying on through the blaze, they soon reached the hole in the wall and passed through it, back outside onto the cold, wet ground. The cool droplets of rain, now a soothing luxury remedy to their burning ordeal. The storm was still raging on outside, yet the sawmill was still ablaze, burning brightly with an orange glow. It shone across the land like a beacon through the dull state of the storm. Plucky and Caesar still ran away from it, through the boggy, deforested area, staggering through the mud again. Suddenly, they reached the same ledge they had both previously jumped off barely a few minutes ago, and climbed it. Both of them panted heavily and found some cover from the rain underneath the tree line, and sat next to each other, both looking back to the blazing inferno, now the other side of the deforested land. Suddenly, there was a loud bang in the distance that echoed from inside the inferno of the sawmill, and then a large plume of fire and smoke. Obviously, the remains of the petrol engine and tank had exploded. The rest of the structure then collapsed around it, still burning, although now exposed to the watery elements. Both foxes stared silently as the fire died down to smoldering wreckage, the orange flush dissipating quickly. It was as if there was no building there to begin with, not but a few minutes ago.
Woo-wee! Now that's what I call a fiery explosion there, don't you say, Dale? That's right, Tucker. Reminded me of an explosion of 1,000 kilos of dynamite.
Thank God, Plucky and Caesar both made it out, and I could stop reading fast. Hopefully I didn't use too much of my phone space. Both of them were quite injured. Plucky, of course, was bleeding from his neck and his scarred leg, as well as a few smaller scratches around his face and body, either from Caesar's claws and teeth or from the smashed glass. Caesar too had a share of injuries. His eye bled freely from where Plucky caught it, and the gash atop his head from the heavy metal pulley too was bleeding vigorously, as well as several cuts across his body. It had certainly been a prolonged, eventful, and vicious duel, but clearly, it was now over.
Whew! Now that was a good death battle, eh, Dale? Yeah, that's right, Tucker. I think we can all agree that both wins.
Thank you, Dale and Tucker. I hope everyone liked my announcer voice for that, with Tucker and Dale, like Wizard Boomstick for Death Battle. But, as for the duel's conclusion, I'd say it's a tie. But what of Scarlet's fate? We'll find out in the last 2 chapters of Animals of Farthing Wood, Journey of a Lifetime. But until then, I'm the Masked Ranger saying keep moving forward, remember the oath, keep it dear to your heart, and thank your lucky stars that both combatants managed to make it out alive. Bye-bye, Disco Inferno!